Hi, everyone. Welcome to AppLovin Connects. We're just waiting a couple minutes for some more of our guests to join, and we'll get started after that. Awesome. So it looks like we've got some more guests who have joined in here. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome to AppLovin Connects. Super excited to be here today. My name is Michael Fortune, and I work in product marketing at AppLovin. Excited because today we're joined by our partners from Luna Labs, from Kwalee, and from SparkLabs to talk about how creatives can positively influence your bottom line. While we're waiting for just a few more guests to arrive, I'd like to point out a little bit about how today's session is going to go. We're going to start off talking a little bit about the agenda, move into the introduction of our guests and panelists, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. We'd love for this to be as interactive as possible, so please do ask questions. You'll note that we've turned off the microphone and videos for the audience, but are reserving that for our speakers. At any point in time, please ask questions using the chat functionality in your GoToWebinar dashboard. Just send those questions to AppLovin Events, and I'll be working with the team in the background to put those together for the Q&A part. Looks like we've got a great group here on the call, so let's go ahead and get things started. For those of you just joining, welcome. We're excited to have you for AppLovin Connects. As I mentioned before, my name is Michael Fortune, and I work in product marketing at AppLovin. And I'm the host for today's session, how strong creatives can positively influence your bottom line. Again, for some details on the Q&A, please feel free to ask questions at any point in time. There's no need to wait for the Q&A to begin. Just make sure you're using the chat functionality in GoToWebinar and sending those to AppLovin Events. We also have a little bit of a surprise at the end, so if you leave early, you'll have no idea what it is. So we're excited to have that. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you not familiar with AppLovin, we fuel the growth of many of the world's top mobile games, bringing games to a wider audience of players around the world. Since 2012, we've worked with the largest game studios and brands from hyper-casual to mid-core. Today, we'll be specifically talking more about hyper-casual and casual games and how you can grow them. SparkLabs is our in-house creative studio, and it's been a key pillar of the growth that I just discussed. It's a team of experienced designers, game developers, and gamers who solve complex problems. They identify creative strategies and follow the data to get you the ads that drive the results you've been dreaming about. So let's move in to talk about our agenda for our session today. We're going to start off having our guests discuss the creative best practices, and from there, we'll hear some tips about how to optimize your creative strategy to capture these industry trends, and we'll wrap everything up together with some live case studies to put what we've discussed into practice. So I'd like to introduce our industry experts to the stage. First, I'd like to introduce Alice Guillaume, who joined AppLovin in 2014 as our Senior Director of Marketing, where she heads up AppLovin's in-house creative studio, SparkLabs. I'd also like to introduce Adam Stevens, the Chief Product Officer at Luna Labs. Adam has been working with app developers for the past 8 years, from Google's AdMob up to Audience Network by Facebook. Now, Adam oversees product strategy and development at Luna Labs. I'd also like to introduce Ryan Davies, Head of Digital Marketing at Kwalee, one of the world's leading hyper-casual publishers and developers. Ryan's been at Kwalee for the last 3 years, overseeing the growth of the early hyper-casual titles all the way up to recent hits such as Off the Rails 3D and Bigot. He's truly been at the forefront of hyper-casual marketing since its inception. So thank you to each of you. We're super excited to have all of you on this today. I'm going to move into the background and turn off my video to gather questions, but I'd love to turn it over to the three of you. So with that, over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that great intro, Michael. And very excited to be here and very excited for Adam and Ryan to join us as well. Today, as Michael talked about, we're going to kick off with talking about some creative best practices. And the first thing we'd like to do is give you guys a framework, and that's a macro view of how to think about developing top performing creatives. First of all, it's more to think about what do you want to achieve. We are giving you 3 subpoints to kind of think about. First is there a clear goal in the creative that you're building? We want to make sure that it's very clear for users when they interact or watch your ad that that's known from the get-go. Then we want to make sure that you're tapping into the motivators that are aligned with your game. So take the time to think through why do people like this game and try to bring that out into your ad. And lastly, is the ad actually fun and entertaining? So that's the high level view. Now we're going to actually give you guys some practical do's and don'ts. And over to you, Ryan, here.
Cool. Yeah. So of course, I think it's easy to kind of get lost in the clouds a bit, to kind of have these high ideas. But of course, if it's good for us and crucial for us to kind of touch on these kind of basics, things that are good kind of launching point for the rest of the stuff that we want to talk about. So let's take a look at those. So of course, and this is a fundamental in any advertising space, but so true for us, and that's establishing a hook. Something that's going to grab the attention. You've probably heard this a million times, but it is true and will always be true that the first 3 seconds of your ad are by far the most crucial. Something that's going to catch the eye and kind of draw the user in is going to be the most important part of your creative and the thing that you need to focus the majority of your time on. Now, there's conditions to this, but it's a fundamental that needs to be cleared and talked about first, that we should all discuss. Of course, on the other hand of this, outside of video, is Playable. While the first 3 seconds within a Playable are a very different experience, the most important thing here is finding an interaction that's engaging, that wants to draw the user in. The first 3 seconds don't apply in the same way, but the same kind of idea of establishing a hook, something to drive the attention, is equally important and demonstrable with this example from our game, Jetpack Jump. Nice, classic.
Great. Moving on to the next principle, it's we want to share with you is tell a clear story. Generally, there are a lot of really exciting features in the game, and it can be easy to want to bring that all out into an ad. However, in a short, bite-sized 15 to 30-second experience, that can be a lot of information. So make it as easy as possible for users to understand what the narrative is, and do that by telling a clear linear story. Like Ryan talked about earlier, the first 3 seconds are absolutely key in hooking in the user, but the next 15, 30, etc. seconds are super important in convincing the user that this is potentially the right game for them. So here we have Klondike Adventures by Visor, and here's a playable that we made showing a very clear linear story. So this is one of the top performing playables for Klondike. As you can tell, it's guided through the narrative in the captions, leading the user through different challenges all the way to the end, and as well as a visual guide of the hand, which is directing the user to follow that linear narrative. Great, so moving on, the next tip we'd like to share with you is keep it simple, decrease cognitive overload for users. There can be a lot of information shown in an ad, and that can actually detract users from being able to understand where to focus on. So it's important to help users out by removing excess UI, cutting down tutorials, cutting down copy, making the mechanics as fluid as possible. So on the right, you'll see 2 examples of how you can visually depict gameplay for Parkmaster by Kayak. And on the bottom is direct gameplay. You can see there's a lot of UI, whether it's multiple cars or parking slots. And on the top, you can see the Playable ad that we made, which really distills it down to the core elements. So we remove the UI, focus to just 2 cars, and one simple directive is just to park those 2 cars. So let's watch the ad. Nice, very simple, very straightforward, and this was the top performing label. Moving on to the next tip is build anticipation. This is an important one, and it can be tricky to do, but when done well, it can be very effective in driving high user engagement. We want to make sure that we are keeping users on the edge of their seats, making them want to go engage. So you can do that through animation. You can do that through different visuals to help highlight that. So let's watch this example of Codescapes, which is probably the easiest way to make that clear. So here you can see the hand is dragging the letters C-A-K to spell cake, and it kind of starts to pause towards the end, which creates that feeling of anticipation or completion for the user to want to finish that word, and that can drive high user engagement. Moving on to the next one is connecting with the users. This one is very important. We want to make sure that the product is approachable to users, and we want to give them a reason to care and engage. One way to do this is stay on top of what's popular in pop culture, what's trending online, and try to bring that back into your creative. So in this example for Wordscapes, you can see how this is linked to, if you've seen the movie Love Actually, there's a scene where the actor is communicating a message through writing on these poster boards. And we took that and married it with Wordscapes. So let's take a look inside. So pretty cheeky, but very cute to see real people in a more approachable style, such as handwriting on the poster board. And this video did perform quite well. All right, continue to share some tips. This one is evoke positive energy. So users are playing mobile games to have fun, to be entertained. So let's make sure to captivate them with entertaining content. Do ensure users, feel happy or feel like they're achieving something, or utilize humor, things like that that evoke positive energy. Generally, I would refrain from communicating high sense of frustration or making it difficult for the user to understand something or accomplish a goal. So here are 2 videos for Sweet Escapes. On the left side is a positive one, on the right side is a more frustrated one. So let's watch them.
Ooh, I'll take a birthday cake. Pretty. Ooh, frosting. Ooh, I like sprinkles.
Super cute. Now let's watch the one on the right.
Let me get something sweet and colorful. Yeah, that one's good. Whoa, ew, what are you doing? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Oh, that's gross. Whoa, take it easy, man.
So between these two, the one that was more positive on the left outperformed the one on the right. I will say though, for hyper casual games, we do see a lot of creators out there that tap into, fail or can you beat this, things like that. I think that is viable for hyper casual games. For games that have a bit more complexity in assets or game mechanics, but still are in the casual end, leaning more towards positive, successful outcomes in general yields higher user engagement. Great. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Adam to talk about what are the essentials for making top performing Playable ads.
Okay, so those were a load of practical do's and don'ts around how to approach thinking about your creatives a little bit differently. But we'd like to take the time now to boil that down into some essentials that you can take away to how you can go and create playables, tomorrow. So let's take a look at what that means for playables first. So the first point, and probably my favorite and what I think is the most important point, is around having a very clear and well-defined tutorial or introduction. The reality is that unlike a video, which can be a little bit passive at times where users can phase in and out of the experience, if you aren't able to convey your message in a very early stages of a playable and get that user to interact and get hooked, then you've got a lost opportunity on your hands. So the first message here is that you really need to focus a lot of your energy on creating a very engaging introduction to your playable ad. The second point is, one of the classics, keep it simple. And we saw some great examples that Alice shared previously. The reality here is that, your game will include a lot of UI and it's very tempting to put that all in. But, what you want to make sure is that you're conveying a very simple and an understandable message to the user. So for example, having a progress bar at the top of your playable is a great UI addition to let the user know how they're tracking. Adding in coins or adding in the name of the level doesn't necessarily add any value. So really try to take a step back and think about what is essential to making this a great experience. The third point, again, similar to the keep it simple, is that, you spent days or weeks, months or years creating your game. It's very tempting to try and condense that all into a playable ad. But the reality is that's often going to do more harm than good. So one of our main recommendations is to try to focus on one, maybe two core mechanics and do it well, and really give that user wanting to learn more and, then downloading your app. The next point is around maintaining a level of excitement. And, you've done a great job of having a tutorial. Your UI is simple. You've got one mechanic that's great, but you need to make sure that you're keeping that user excited. So having positive confirmation when they do something correctly or when they don't do something correctly, having a flashing object to let them know which way to go in a playable ad, just continually letting them know that they're heading on the right direction is a great way to keep them engaged. The fifth point here is making it easy for users to succeed. And, success to you could be fail or win, like we saw in the previous example. But the idea is to not let the user get lost at any time. So, a really bad case that you could end up in is having the user kind of stuck, not knowing where to go, and they end up not losing or winning. You want to have a very predefined direction for the user that you can then measure results on and make decisions. And, a good tactic here is to include a timer in your playable that after 10, 15 seconds of gameplay, you show the user, unfortunately, you didn't win this time. Do you want to try again? Or, direct them to the App Store to continue that experience. But at no point do you want the user to get lost. And then the final is, something that we can forget from time to time, and that's just make the playable ad fun. I think when, you follow these 5 previous steps, you can get a little bit bogged down in the weeds around what am I doing? Do I need to do A or B to make my playable ads, perform better? But the reality is if you create a fun experience, then the performance will come. So really focus on ways that you can, jazz that up with some UI, some animations, particle systems. And a great idea is to give the user some visual awards. So, after completing an objective, show them a piece of art or UI that you haven't showed them before, or offer them something slightly new about the next piece of that playable. But yeah, I think keeping it fun is always something that, you know, we have to keep in mind.
Great. So I think next is me, and you know, in the same way that Adam's provided some overarching best guides and principles for playables, I think the same thing can be applied to video. There's elements there that are transferable, but of course video has some of its kind of own unique foibles and different elements. So just want to run through a few of those as well from my perspective. So of course, you know, a lot of these points, I'd say these points kind of stack up. They run together and they flow together. Of course, any good key piece of video is going to tell a good story. You know, we work in advertising, sure, but ultimately a good piece of creative is something that engages people on a kind of an emotional level, and therefore tells a story that they can understand, believe in, and become engaged with. You know, as I mentioned before, the key and the crux to any beginning of any creative like that is the first 3 seconds where you're trying to hook someone. You know, contrary to another piece of media, they may not be going out of their way to look for that piece of advertisement, so you need to kind of reel them in. Wow moments are something that I think is an interesting concept, in that, you know, as Alice said before, you've got more than 3 seconds. Sure, you need those core 3 seconds to lure people in, but ultimately you've got another 27 seconds or 13 seconds, whatever it may be, to continue to engage them. And having those core moments, whether it's 3, 4, 5 spread out throughout a piece of creative, you're giving them constantly something to be engaged with, something to entice them a little bit further, to push them a little bit further through it, and ultimately be kind of amused, entertained by it by the time they've reached the peak of the creative and had that full narrative told. And basically those satisfaction points for me, I think, are the key to those wow moments. So, you know, within hyper casual, admittedly, we have it a little easier sometimes. Finding those satisfaction points are essentially the core, the crux of everything we do, both from a game design standpoint and a creative standpoint. But looking for those, what are the elements in your game that are causing people to get a rise, to find something interesting, to excite them? Identifying those early, making them a key part of your video, making them your wow moments. You know, that's absolutely crucial. And you know, that comes with understanding and finding the most exciting features within your game. And I think, you know, through all this, and probably one of the most transferable things from playable to video is finding simplicity. You know, this matches with probably the world that we live in now, that stripping back, focusing on the core of what you're advertising, what you're selling, is really proven to be working across any industry, but certainly holds true for the mobile industry right now. And of course, within my own vertical hyper casual, simplicity is absolute key. So finding that within your copy, within your UI, and other elements of the creative are crucial. So the combination of all these things kind of stacked on top of each other, I think, are elements that any kind of creative team needs to be thinking about.
Awesome. So you heard from all of us a bunch of tips from the macro level view to practical do's and don'ts, and summaries of what, you know, best practices per ad type. We're going to transition now towards creative optimization strategy. So, you know, a question that we do get quite often is how to produce creatives for UA and game marketability testing strategically and at scale. This is a great question and very important to running successful creative teams. So we put together a few principles that we'll share with you, and we'll walk you through them. Principle 1, I'll start off, is know the core value your creatives need to add. Sounds very simple and straightforward, but is super key, and taking the time to do this actually will set your team up for stronger success. It's easy to just hit the ground running and want to start making a variety of concepts, but take a step back and partner with your business teams to understand what the core KPI your creatives need to meet are. Because if you're not aligned there, you could be making creatives and spending resources and time that don't meet those business needs. For example, let's say the U team is just looking to drive high volume, or let's say they're looking to drive high volume and high user quality. Whatever the goal is, that does translate into the mindset of how your creatives are being produced on the team. For example, if you're looking to drive high volume, perhaps we lean more towards you know, mainstream concepts, perhaps a bit less relevant, just to hook users in. versus focusing on higher user quality. We may want to really focus on core gameplay, relevant assets, things like that. So principle 1, know the core value your creatives need to add. Principle 2, know what you're up against. This one's super important also to do before you start, hitting pen to paper. It's research creative performance. Look at what's running in the market, look at what you're up against, and make sure your designers are aware of that, because that helps them understand what the bar is that they need to outperform. And on SparkLabs, it's important that every single person on the team not only wears the hat of being a creative, but also the hat of being a performance marketer. They need to understand at a high level what the metrics are, what they mean, and what variables to test that could move those metrics in certain directions. So this part's super key for prep work, again, in gearing up for creative production. And I'm going to pass it over to Adam, who's going to share a few more principles.
Great. So principle 3 is design a testing plan, even if it's not perfect. And I think the general sentiment here is that you want to be prepared for your testing before you even consider going live. And so sitting down with a team, generating a creative strategy, and what we would like to recommend is having a base set of creatives that you can then move on and test within. So for example, with Playables, it could be creating a base scene that you have a number of different variations around, or with a video, it could be storyboarding 2 or 3 or 4 different concepts that when you do go live and you start getting that test data in, you know instantly how to react based on the results. And at no point do you want to be stuck having to go back to the drawing board and wondering how you're going to achieve the performance you want. So really creating a strong base with the ability to test is really key to success here. And then principle 4 is track everything, find big wins and big losses. And I think it's really important that you are ready to fail and fail quickly, but also learn from those failures so that you can succeed. And something that Ryan taught me very early on was that try as much as you want. You may have to iterate 100 times on a video or a playable, and it can just be the matter of fact that it never outperforms that first control test that you had. But that's fine, because you know that you're going through the motions and testing so that you have confidence in the performance that you're achieving, and you know that you've explored all avenues. But the final point here is that you will have to A/B test a lot, and it's really the definitive way to test creatives. But try not to get too bogged down in the weeds. Let the data speak for itself. Make decisions quickly and move on. And that's how you're really going to create that virtuous cycle of testing and repeating and improving.
Great. So I think I've got the final point here, and this is principle 5, basically keep an open and organized mind. So this really comes down to the team, the people that you're working with, the people that you're organizing, or whatever the case may be in a situation. It's very easy in this role, as a person who's creating these kind of creative works every day, for them to become a bit isolated, and for the things they're doing and the creative works they're coming up with to be independent. But of course, this is not really what you want. The way to open up is to allow people to brainstorm collectively. It avoids kind of overlapping of creative. It avoids people becoming kind of stifled and unimaginative, I guess. But it ensures your team is kind of following this direct path and you're following the same ideas together. But also that you've got this kind of open flow of creativity in between people. In some ways, this seems like an obvious point, but it's very easy to slip into this motion of people being very independent and working on their own when you want them to be collaborating and talking together. Ultimately, this is creative. It needs people to be acting and behaving creatively. So having strong project management is a key part of that. It was a big move and a great move for my team when we added basically a creative producer to our video team that allowed us to kind of have that slightly more top level view to organize and facilitate outside of just raw kind of creativity. But the last part that I'd add to this, especially when people are kind of mixing ideas, it's very easy for this kind of like group subconscious to form, and I'm always super wary of it. And something I try to do to avoid that is try looking for people, hiring people that are going to bring a different perspective. It's very easy to kind of fall into these biases, basically. These kind of concepts and ideas that you've become kind of a bit ritualistic. But it's good to kind of get out of that, try and break that. And I think brainstorming helps with this, but also just being aware of it and kind of acting on it and adapting with it is also super important. So these are all big ones to me. So as well as that, it's good to understand the principles, the ideas that we're following here. But of course, we don't live in a vacuum, as Alice touched on. There's things happening across the industry, and it's very important for us to understand what's happening, what's going on, what are the trends, what are the things we want to identify, and there's some we want to pick up on here and bring up. So let's kind of show through some of these ideas that I think me and Adam both want to display. So of course, I guess some may paint me as an eternal pessimist. I'm not sure. Maybe they would. But I kind of intrigued by the challenges that are coming up. Maybe this is the optimistic view, is that they are challenges. They're things that can be overcome. So I kind of want to demonstrate some of the thinking at the moment on my mind of challenges that we're kind of looking at Kwalee, but as an industry as a whole, and what does that pose for creative? So a big one for me, for sure, is essentially the idea that this links to what Alice said earlier, in the form of a creative team needs to have a slight hat of a UA manager or something like that. I think that flips back the other way as well, and I think that this is becoming increasingly prevalent and increasingly important, and a challenge that a lot of teams are starting to have to deal with. So I think it's very important that a UA team member also has a very fundamental understanding of creative principles and practices. It allows them to operate better. It allows them to kind of make decisions better. I think, it's not ideal for them to be thinking, oh, I just need this next batch of creative, or I need this new thing. I need, I've got this extra stuff that I want to cycle in. They need to be thinking critically about the content that they are running on their campaigns and how it can be improved, how it can be adapted, and make sure that line of communication is open. And of course, that fits generally with a marketing team, or whatever other departments in a company, depending on how big it is. A process needs to be put in place and fit that allows people to communicate and suggest these ideas and creative thoughts. I've got an example later, and I will demonstrate that, of how that can be put into practice and how it can advantage you. Another challenge, this is an eternal one, but I think is becoming increasingly prevalent as this market and this industry keeps heating up and getting more competitive, is staying on top of current trends. Like I said, we don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum even within gaming or mobile. Everything we do is influencing the world around us. Everything that we see is being influenced. So it's important to kind of identify these elements and kind of work with them. It's always going to be a challenge, but it's an interesting one at the moment, because especially given the times, trends are different and constantly evolving, and endless amounts of toilet paper references. All these kind of things are always worth bearing in mind and keeping focused on. And the last part, which for me is always a big one, I suppose, coming from the kind of more UA background and side, the demands for creative and the methods, the techniques in which you're using that creative are always shifting. And that also means that the creative that you're producing to adapt to those techniques needs to shift as well. And that's a big one. Different channels present different challenges, and you're adding new things and taking away old things, and adapting to that is hard. And it's part of the reason you need to make sure those first 2 points that I mentioned are in sync. The people you're talking to, the people that are working at this, are all communicating, because it'll just make that last point of shifting priorities and strategy much easier to deal with. So yeah, those are some challenges, and maybe Anna can provide a more optimistic view.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I mean, yeah, it's the way that you look at it, but the reality is that with these challenges, there's a huge amount of opportunity for us, as an industry to progress. And we're excited to share a couple of the ideas that we have and what we're hearing within our functional units around what we think will be the biggest opportunities for us in the next 6 months or even next year. So the first one of these is around automation. So whilst UA teams and creative teams, like Ryan's, are looking for ways to unlock potentially ways to make more creatives, better quality creatives with new ideas, there's going to be essentially a bottleneck around that, with having more creators but not knowing how to kind of deal with that. And so you don't want to have a UA team who have all these creators but no way to efficiently use them. And so we really think that automation is going to play a big role in the near future, which will help UA teams be much more efficient. And then a big piece of automation is all related to data. And so that's the second trend, which we think an opportunity that lies here is around analytics. So when you've got all of these creatives and you're able to upload them more efficiently with automation, you're going to want to understand how they're performing. And we live in a world right now where you can look at two playables or two videos and see the performance, but really you don't know much more about that. And we think that the next level is to take analytics and look at things like the metadata or the story or the copy or the UI style within any given creative and make more valid and judged opinions on that in order to fuel your creativity for future campaigns. And if we look at that a little bit deeper with playable ads, because of the technology that's being used, which is HTML5, there's a real opportunity there to create dynamic content, potentially served to an individual user. So right now you have a playable ad that wins a campaign's performance, and you're essentially serving the same ad to every user who sees it. There's a huge opportunity to tailor that ad experience down to the user level so that one user might see a blue ad where you win, one might see a red ad where you lose. But essentially you want to make sure that you're driving the metrics that mean something to you, but also that means something to the user in terms of the experience that are driving that results.
Awesome. Thanks for all that input on industry creative trends, Adam and Ryan. So we just shared a lot of content with you guys, and now we're going to apply it to some case studies, which I know you are going to be very interested in looking at. So we'll start off with one from SparkLabs, and this is Parkmaster, which I showed earlier when we went through practical do's and don'ts. So at a high level, what we did here is we partnered with Kayak to give guidance and ultimately create a playable ad that was much more simplified down and gave users a positive reinforcement at the end. And the results were, it did drive a 50% IPM lift and was a top volume driver for Kayak, helping them get to #1 for Parkmaster. So that was pretty exciting result, and we were happy to partner with Kayak on that. Moving on to the next case study. This one is with Unico. So SparkLabs partnered with Unico to help develop creatives for their game Brain Test. Unico, very talented team. However, difficult to create creatives at a high amount of volume every week and continue to optimize and test. So we were happy to help them do that. And what we worked on here is making sure there was a clear challenge from the get-go, really also simplifying the UI here, hooking the players in through an engaging series of questions and prompts, and then making sure that we position this to align with motivations of the players there. So if you watch this ad, it's pretty fun. So this ad helped drive a 230% increase in daily install volume and boosted conversion rates by 35%. So that's a pretty nice lift. What I think is valuable takeaway here is there were a lot of very engaging levels within this game. But picking ones that were approachable through day-to-day, such as the water kettle, the screaming baby. Those are things that users may be curious to play around with and tinker with to solve that problem. And we also tested a couple of variations with just one problem versus 3 problems, and the longer challenge version did outperform the shorter one. So I think that was valuable information for us to ascertain that providing meaningful challenges and providing multiple of them helps hook the user in to better understand the mechanics and understand if they want to continue to play more or not. So these are 2 fun case studies from SparkLabs. So I'll pass it on to Ryan now.
Great. So yeah, I've got here a couple of examples of videos. Don't want to steal the limelight from Adam and Playable. So the first example here is for Bake It, one of our more recent successful games. And I think it's a great example of lots of things we've been talking about. But to me, there's a few kind of things I want to point out before we show it. This game in some ways is very open-ended, very free form. The crux, if you've not seen the game, is that you can kind of create essentially like cakes or pastries using this kind of like mechanic of pushing dough through like a nozzle. And in the game, it's quite open-ended. You can do what you want, but something that kind of helps a lot in the creative to kind of give the user a goal and aim rather than just being kind of random movements is you can see here the kind of white trace line that gives someone the kind of aim to kind of cycle and focus. So whether it's a playable or it's a video, it gives them something to focus on and something to kind of understand and also to follow as a kind of a story, as a narrative. What I think this ad does very nicely, which relates to some stuff that we've mentioned before, is actually provide a slight point of frustration, but also just in a very small and subtle way. You'll see from the ad, basically the person doing it doesn't get it quite right. It's a little bit off, which kind of gives you that slight sense of like, yeah, I could do that just a little bit better. So I think on that front, a combination of those two things really helps bring the ad together nicely. So you can see that quickly. Yeah, see that little bump gets everyone every time. Cool. So the next one I kind of want to show is actually something really quite different. That being an ad for a game that was fresh, new, that was like the lead creative for that, you could say. This is something very different. So for our game Draw It, which you may have heard of, it's done very, very well for us. But this ad creative came along for it, into the hundreds. We'd made loads and loads of creative for a long time. People had probably started to get a bit sick of it, I won't lie. But it brings up the question then of how do you find something different? How do you find something new? How do you actually kind of keep this game moving, keep it working without having to rely on the same creative that you've relied on for the last 3 months or whatever? And in this case, it's obviously something very different. I would Draw It, a game that's traditionally played on kind of like a blank canvas. We kind of proposed this idea of it being kind of like a tattoo instead. And in reality, this was long before kind of tattooing was a more kind of common creative trend, I guess. And I think this is another really good example, an interesting example of how sharing knowledge between teams can be really important, because this specific example of creative didn't come from the creative team that we have at Kwalee. It actually came from one of the members of the UA team. So it shows how having them thinking about this stuff and also communicating clearly between those teams can lead to really positive results. So yeah, let's have a look at this slightly unusual one for Draw It. Yeah, great. So yeah, it's a great example of how you may be on your 100, 200 creative, and you may be struggling to beat the last one that you're relying on your control creative, but they can come along and good ideas can kind of come from anywhere. So I always love that as an example.
Yeah, that's a great one. And so I'll wrap it up with case studies. And we're very happy to share a case study that's kind of a combination of work from Lunar Labs and also Boombit, one of our partners. And the game is Tug of War. So the challenge for Boombit was being able to create an ad which actually generated that kind of sentiment that you want to have from an ad, which gives that user the sense of satisfaction, really taps into the motivators that drive them to play that game again and again. In this case, dragging an opponent's car through some kind of destructive mechanic. And I think also they had the kind of the realization that they have a load of cars in the game and a load of different background themes, and they just didn't have a very quick and easy way to test and understand which combinations would work well. So we partnered with them, and we were able to create a playable scene which really looked and felt like the game and gave the user a great experience. But also they plugged into our Playable AI module, which automatically and dynamically optimizes the ad based on the combinations that they want. And that really was able to drive results for them. And what that meant was that we were able to drive 85% increased CVR based on the previous playables. And I think, you know, that is really satisfying to play if you happen to run across it. Cool. So I think that's it from us generally. You know, we've shared a lot of information, and I know soon we'll go to QA, and thank you all for staying with us, and we're excited to take your questions. But before we get there, just like to wrap up and share some final thoughts from the three of us. So, I mean, the reality is that, you know, creatives are a mixture of art and science, and you really got to be very open and willing to test. And I think, you know, Ryan's case study around the tattoo was a great example of how, you know, perseverance and testing and creativity can really result in quite exciting results. But, you know, when it comes down to practicalities, you want to have your testing in place, and you want to have your KPIs already measured before launching. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're about to launch a game and you haven't thought about creatives. And that kind of ties us into the second point, which is creatives need to become a fundamental part of the studio's design process. And we're seeing more and more trends around developers and marketing teams working hand in hand, and even examples of games taking things which work well in creatives and using that back within the game. So we really think that, you know, you need to plan ahead, and you know, that also ties into the resources. So you need to have both people and budgets signed ready for these tests, and to give them a fair chance. Because ultimately, if you can gather that data, you can gather that know-how and expertise inside your studio, then when you do come to launch, you know that you're set up for the best possible success you could have.
All right, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you to Adam and Ryan for joining us and sharing their great insights. We hope everyone found something valuable from this webinar, whether it's from the practical do's and don'ts, or learning about some principles about creative optimization strategy, or looking ahead at some of our industry trends. At this point, I'm going to pass this back to Michael.
Thanks, everyone. That was fantastic. Everyone did a great job. We're looking forward to starting the Q&A. Just give us a moment. We're going to switch gears a little bit and get started there. Thanks.